All right. Hey, everyone. Like Rex mentioned, my name's Anand. I'm going to talk very briefly today about demystifying product management. So I am a product manager. So a little bit about my background. What did I do before Gusto? So I'm currently a product lead. Before this, I was at Dropbox for a long time, actually in this office. Before that, was at Zynga for a while and ran product management on Words with Friends and some of the other With Friends games. But what I wanted to start with is what most people think product management is. And when I sort of did a poll of people on our engineering team or on our design team, we got back a lot of this stuff. It's like black turtlenecks, and you come in and you like put Post-it notes on whiteboards, and you ask users what you want, and you ignore it because they don't know what they want. Like everyone thinks it's like that sort of thing, right? Especially people who've never done it before or who have never interacted with someone who is a professional product manager. And like, not surprisingly, that's definitely not right. But I think a more important question is like, what do you miss if that's what you believe? So if you believe that, like, where does this understanding like lead you astray? And I think where it leads you astray is like you don't know how to interact with magic. Like if you think that something is like a black box or something that can't be explained, or it's all about like which turtleneck you picked in the morning, you have no like reasonable person way of interacting with this thing. You don't know how to inject yourself into the process. So it disempowers the rest of the people in your company from actually being effective in your product process. And one of the things that I've seen and is also a Gusto like product value is we think good ideas can come from anywhere. And if PMs think of themselves as the gatekeepers of good ideas, you're basically going to have a bad time at your company because you're going to miss out on a bunch of really good things. So how can you actually teach everybody at your organization, not just the product managers, how can you give them the tools to be involved in a like product process in the right way? So the best way I've found to do this is actually to have something that's a product development process. And it's a little bit overkill. You don't really need the process piece of it necessarily. But what it does is it helps people feel way more ownership over what's actually going on in your product. And it generally improves understanding. I think this is something I touched on a lot of times in the previous two talks, where if you can explain to someone what you're doing and you can give them basic PM skills, you can sort of back away from the idea of defining every single possible thing and actually empower people at your company to make decisions about things. So I'm going to give a very, very brief, abridged version of what we do at Gusto and actually what we did at Dropbox as well. It is wildly abridged. There are a lot of things that are not going to be right about the like 6 slides, but sort of go with the spirit of it, and I'll give you a sense of what we do. So let's start with the beginning. There are basically 3 phases to the product development process that we use at Gusto. And the first step is to figure out what problem you're solving and why it's important. And I think this already came up actually a lot in the first talk. If you get this part wrong, you're going to have a bad time. You need to know exactly like what you're doing, who you're solving a problem for, and like why it's important for people. And this is actually where I ask the PMs on my team to spend most of their time. I think a lot of PMs get dragged into very heavy project management components or very heavy design components. And what I've just found in my experience is that the more you can make this the home of PMs, the better time you're going to have in your organization. Because if you know exactly what you're trying to do and what you're accomplishing, generally good stuff will happen. So the second step is, now that we know what problem we're solving, how do we actually build it? And not surprisingly, this is primarily the home of design. In general, there's usually more than one way to solve a problem. Not always, but usually there's more than one good way. And this is just trying to figure out what's the best way. And then the last one is we actually need to build the thing. Many people in this room are probably experts in this, so I'm sort of going to gloss over this a little bit. But this is very traditionally the home of engineering. So I'll walk very quickly through like 1 or 2 ideas on each of the steps that I've just found helpful in my experience. And then we'll talk about why it's actually been useful for us. So in terms of opportunity evaluation, like what does that mean? At Gusto, we define it to be an idea that has been validated to be both good for the company and the user. And there's like a lot of meaning in that sentence, so I want to unpack it a little bit. And I'll start with the second part. What does it mean to be at the intersection of things that are good for the user and good for the company? And one way to talk about this is by giving examples. So if you are old enough to remember Napster, Napster is like a fantastic product for users. Like infinite free music for 0 money is one of the best like value propositions you'll ever hear. But that is a terrible business. So like you built something that's amazing for customers and really bad for your business. On the other side of things, how many people here have like Comcast as your internet provider? Like raise your hand. How many people here want to have Comcast as their internet provider? Exactly 0 people, right? So like on the other side of things, but Comcast is a $186 billion market cap company. So like something went okay. But what they're missing is that revenue is a lagging indicator of value. And also they're a monopoly. So those are 2 good things they have going for them. But what you want is you want to be in the middle. Like the sweet spot of good for the product, good for the company and good for the user is exactly in the middle of those things. And the classic example of a product here is the iPhone. The iPhone will cost you $700 and it costs 40% margins, which is wildly unheard of in hardware. And people line up at midnight to buy it. And that's what you want. You want that thing. So we spend a lot of time making sure we're at the intersection of stuff that's really good for users and really good for the company. And when you can explain this to everyone in your organization, it just changes the way people think. They don't come and they say, we should do this thing because it'll make $50,000. They don't come and do this thing because this is fantastic for all of our users, but will cost us $10 million. They start to think about stuff in the middle. There's a second part of this, which is the validation. How do you validate an idea? And I sort of skipped that in the first one. The most common thing that I see for actually product managers as well as people not in product is they'll come and they'll say, I have an idea. What if we built X? And what if we built Y? And this is usually the biggest possible mistake that you can make. And the reason it's a mistake is it conflates problems and solutions. And you're starting off in the solution space instead of starting off in the problem space. And again, really bad stuff is going to happen here. So if you teach only one thing to your organization out of this entire talk, this would be the one thing that I teach people. And what it does is it forces people to take a step back and start bringing you why we should solve a problem and not what we should solve. And I can give you tons of stories after this about where this has gone well, but more importantly, where this has gone poorly. Again, if you only take one thing away as I should teach this to my organization, teach them this and good stuff will happen. So now a little bit about the design piece. I'm going to skip over the details and the tactics, but basically the best way that I've found to try and help other people understand what the purpose of good design is to not think like yourself. Your job, both as a product manager and a designer, is to think like someone who isn't you. And for the most part, most of the time, the people who are building the thing are not the same as the people using the thing. Some exceptions maybe actually in this room with developer tools. But for the most part, if you think like you, you're going to build the wrong thing. So a lot of the time we spend teaching our organization is don't think like yourself. And when you try and apply that model, some really interesting things happen from a development perspective, because people on your customer service team or on your sales team will stop coming with requests and saying, I think this is great. They'll start saying, I think that the customer thinks this is great, and that's a totally different mental model to have. Some random pro tips that I found to be pretty useful here. In general, it's been pretty helpful for me to try and actually constrain the solution space with the problem space that I talked about before. We again touched on this, I think, a little bit in the first conversation. If you can say, this is out of scope, or this is the thing that matters, or this is the thing that doesn't matter, again, good stuff will happen for your business. The second one on just the design thing, and not only the design thing, but for our sales team and our care team, constantly talking to users. I've never run into a scenario once in my career where I felt like I talked to users too much. I've only run into a scenario where I thought I talked to them not enough. And even teaching this to people like our care organization or our sales team or other people who may or may not always interact with users in the same way has really helped them get a better understanding of why some stuff is being prioritized and why some stuff is not being prioritized. So the last phase is building it, and this is probably the one I'll skip over the most. There are tons of different methodologies here, especially in fintech. This doesn't always apply. But in general, most of what we build to is not really a static concept. And this idea of the spec as the perfect document that captures all knowledge about this thing doesn't really work. There are probably some exceptions, if you're making the Hoover Dam or you're making a 747, your spec should probably be right. But for most of the stuff that most people in this room probably do, the bar is probably a little bit lower than that. Maybe some exceptions with banks. But this is another thing you can teach your organization. And the reason you can teach your organization this, and it's important, is one of the most common questions we get is where's the perfect source of truth that I can read the one-page document and know everything about what's happening? And that's not a thing. That has never been a thing, and it won't be a thing. But when you teach people that and we explain how this is an iterative process, again, you'll help with understanding for parts of your organization that are not doing this professionally to understand that there is no 30-second version of full context on something. And if they want to get involved, they have to get involved. I'm going to skip this one a little bit. I think the short version is most people here probably do some sort of iterative development. And it tends to reduce cost and increase speed, but it means this stuff is changing a lot. And explaining this again to your organization of V1 is not the same as V2, is not the same as V3, and just because we did this thing today does not mean it will be this forever, has also just been a helpful concept for us. So let's say you do all of these things and you teach people the last 10 slides and you do a 5-minute talk. What are some of the things that I've seen happen both at Gusto and at previous companies? Well, the first one is everyone knows how to get involved. And what you've done is you've created a common language and a common terminology and a common framework for how to hang ideas on. And I'll give a very specific example from Gusto. One of the things that happened within our care organization is we basically transitioned them mostly away from talking about solutions and almost entirely to talking about problems. And this has been extremely beneficial for us as a business. They don't come anymore and say, I want to build like specific feature X. What they come is they say, I've heard 100 different people all talk about this sort of thing. And that means that this sort of problem is important. So can we please find a good way to solve this sort of problem? And that just means that signal to noise that's coming out of those other teams has basically flipped. It used to be almost garbage. Like you'll talk to 1,000 people and get almost no information. And now the fidelity is much, much higher. So our product managers have better input into making good decisions. But just as importantly, those people finally feel heard. Like I can't tell you how many times we've talked to a team where they're like, oh, it finally feels like you're listening and you're actually doing something that we asked for. But the like magic trick to doing that is not to like ask louder or have some prioritization meeting where you have a spreadsheet with like 700 rows and you make a bunch of like stack rank stuff. Like that will never work. The way to do it is to like speak the language of how we prioritize and how we pick. And the minute we got people into the problem space and out of the solution space, a lot of good stuff happened there. The second thing that it does is it helps people just understand what a product manager's job was. It's really dangerous in my experience where PMs feel like they're doing whatever they want. And where like prioritization is a dark art and nobody understands like why we're doing this thing instead of the other thing. It stops your company from being collaborative and people just don't want to get involved. And a lot of people get really irritated. So even just the general understanding of like how this works at a very macro sense has been extremely collaborative from just a culture perspective. And it's made it easier for our product team to mesh with the other teams because the same way that like we understand what a salesperson does, they now understand what a product person does. And they also apply their own filters. So the most interesting takeaway from all of this stuff is instead of getting everyone's like first idea that comes off their head, they'll run through their own like mini version of this thing. And if it passes their filter, like then the idea comes out. So you just eliminate a lot of the like noise again, and you get a lot of the better signal. And again, good things happen. So the last thing I wanted to end on is like don't worry too much about the process part. A thing that I've consistently seen fail at different organizations is to try and impose process, which is basically pure tax and has no benefit for that person. If the pain is being felt somewhere else and you ask someone to change their process, they're not going to change their process. So don't fixate too much on like the process piece of this. If you just think of this as like terminology or a framework or even better, just common understanding, a lot of good stuff will happen. Whether you actually go through every detail and have design checkpoints and building checkpoints like the way we talked about it is a lot less important. It's really just so that everybody in your organization knows what it takes to build a good product, but more importantly, so they know how to contribute in a way that's both productive and actually likely to have them be listened to. So with that, any questions?
Yeah, you got a slide that said something reduces thrash, and I wonder if you could elaborate on that.
Let me find my slide because I don't remember. I think it was the design section. This one?
Yeah.
Sure. So one of the ways I've seen projects go really wrong in this like design phase is if you make small decisions before you make big decisions. And in general, if you think of like the size of decision you're making, it should sort of be asymptotic. Like at the made up example, at the very beginning, you should decide like what language am I going to write this in. If you change that on the last day, that's not a good plan. At the end, on the last day, though, if the question is the text in italics or in bold, that's totally fine. Like that's the sort of things you should be doing. So even just having a framework that you can explain to people that big decisions come early and small decisions come late solves a lot of problems. And the reason it solves problems is when you go to a marketing person and you show them something and you tell them you're at the beginning of the process and they're like, the words are wrong. You're like, the words are not the important thing that I need you to understand here. What I need you to understand here is like, is the overall structure correct? So when you tell people like this level of fidelity is appropriate for this part of the conversation, you get much better feedback and you don't get teams going in like random directions. Yeah. Sure. Let me actually give an example from Dropbox just because I have a really good one. So one of the things I worked on at Dropbox was an audit log. And the basic idea is you want to see who you're sharing stuff with. Okay, cool. So we call up a bunch of people who had asked about an audit log at some point. And I get a guy on the phone, and he runs a sales team of 30 or 40 people in the Midwest. And I asked him why he wants an audit log. And he's like, well, I keep hiring people, and I can't remember what I'm supposed to share with them. So I want to have my like canonical salesperson, who's basically the first person I hired, like go see all of their stuff. And then I want to open like Firefox over here, and I want to have like a different session with this new person who I've hired, and I want to like go and share all the things back and forth with them. I was like, dude, you want groups. This is the wrong solution for your problem, right? But like the only way to figure out the difference between the problem and the solution is to go talk to this guy. So if you ask him and you ask a salesperson to like put the feedback in Salesforce that's like why you lost this deal, they're going to write down we lost this deal because of an audit log, but actually what you want is groups. So that's the difference between like the problem and the solution space is you teach people not to write down audit log, you teach them to write down groups. Yeah.
But how do you go about teaching them to write about groups? So how do you focus on like these are the solutions and for example like audit log,
Sure.
not the appropriate.
Yep. So the question is, how do you actually do that? The best way I've found is to dolphin train people. You positively reinforce good behavior, and you basically ignore all bad behavior. I'm not even kidding. So what happens is a lot of the people in the sales and the marketing organizations are unfortunately used to not being listened to, especially from a product perspective. Like there are probably, let's say there's 1,000 product requests per year. How many do you actually build? Like 10, maybe 15? And you're doing your own stuff in a corner, right? So how do you get them excited? You get them excited by showing results. So if you can teach your organization that if you talk in a certain way and you present information in a certain way and you prioritize in a certain way, then the thing will actually happen. That's a great pitch to everybody on your sales, marketing, BD, partner teams. So the best way I've found to do this is basically to pick a couple people who sort of show inclinations to be willing to do this and build their stuff. It doesn't work if you mandate it again. I've tried this at 4 companies now, where you go to the sales team and you say, can you write down really detailed reasons that we didn't get this deal? But a salesperson, especially on variable comp, is next deal, next deal, next deal, next deal, right? They're not going to sit there and take notes for 70 seconds on the phone call they just had, unless it's in their best interest. So the honest answer is we just reward good behavior, and that makes good behavior spread. Any other questions? Cool. Thank you, guys.
Thanks very much, everyone, for coming out. And let's have one more round of applause for all of our speakers tonight. That's great. And thanks to Stripe for hosting us, too. It's been awesome.